The night at Fort Benning was no different from countless others, calm, orderly, and steeped in routine. William Henry Hance sat at the dining table, a plate of untouched food before him. Across the table, Rachel, his wife of 8 years, moved her fork around her plate absent-mindedly. The hum of the kitchen light filled the silence between them, but William noticed something else, a flicker of unease in Rachel's eyes. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice steady but probing. Rachel startled slightly, then forced a smile. "Yes, just tired." William studied her carefully. Rachel had always been a lively woman, full of laughter and charm, but lately there was a change. It wasn't just fatigue, it was something deeper. He couldn't shake the nagging thought that she was hiding something. As if on cue, the phone rang, shattering the uneasy quiet. Rachel shot up from her seat, almost knocking her chair over in the process. "I'll get it," she said quickly, darting toward the kitchen phone. William's eyes followed her every move. He couldn't hear the words, but Rachel's tone was soft, almost secretive. The brief exchange ended with her placing the receiver down far too gently, her back still turned to him. "Who was it?" William's question hung heavy in the air. Rachel hesitated, her hand resting on the counter. "Just a friend from the base," she said, her voice measured. She didn't turn around. "Which friend?" he pressed, his stomach tightening. "Someone from the wives group," she replied too quickly, too casually before changing the subject. "Did you want more coffee?" "No," William said, his voice flat. His appetite had vanished completely. Later that evening, after Rachel had gone to bed, William sat alone in the dimly lit living room. His mind raced with unanswered questions. Something wasn't right, and he could feel it in his gut. He glanced at the clock on the wall, 11:45 p.m. Unable to resist the urge any longer, he quietly made his way to their bedroom. Rachel's steady breathing told him she was asleep. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on her purse, which sat partially open on the dresser. His hands trembled as he reached for it, guilt battling with suspicion. Inside, he found what he didn't want to find, a torn piece of paper with jagged edges, as if hastily ripped from a notebook. It bore the words, "Can't wait to see you again, love T." His heart pounded as he stared at the note. T? Who was T? His mind cycled through possibilities, but none of them made sense. He placed the paper back carefully and returned to the living room, the weight of the discovery pressing down on him. The following morning, Rachel acted as though nothing had happened. She hummed softly while making coffee, her movements graceful and practiced. But for William, every detail felt amplified. Her too bright smile, the slight hesitation when he caught her eye. "Busy day at the base?" she asked, setting a steaming cup in front of him. "Same as always," he replied curtly. He watched her carefully, waiting for any sign that might betray her thoughts. As the days passed, the tension between them grew, though unspoken. Rachel continued her routine, but William noticed the small cracks in her facade, her nervous glances, the way she kept her purse closer than usual. One evening, Rachel left the house, claiming she had errands to run. William sat in his truck, parked discreetly across the street, and watched her leave. His pulse quickened as he followed her. Rachel drove to a secluded spot near the base where another car was already waiting. A man stepped out, young, confident, and familiar. It was Thomas Reed, a soldier William had seen around the barracks. As William gripped the steering wheel, rage and betrayal coursed through him. He watched as Rachel and Thomas exchanged smiles and then disappeared into the darkness. The days following William's discovery were tense. The note, tucked hastily back into Rachel's purse, became an anchor of suspicion that weighed him down. He couldn't shake the image of her meeting Thomas in the dark, their shared smiles like a dagger to his pride. But he needed more than just a torn piece of paper to confront her. He needed the full truth. One evening, after Rachel left the house for her usual errands, William decided it was time. He stood in their bedroom, the faint hum of the ceiling fan his only companion. His hands trembled as he reached into her drawer. The faint scent of her perfume lingered, but beneath it was something colder, the weight of betrayal. Tucked beneath a stack of scarves, William found a bundle of envelopes bound with a thin ribbon. His chest tightened as he sat down and unfolded the first letter. "Rachel, last night was perfect. I can't stop thinking about you, about us, the way you smiled." I've never felt this way before. We have to find a way to be together. I know it's complicated, but you're worth it. Love, T. William stared at the signature, his blood running cold. T. The same name from the note. Each letter in the bundle was more damning than the last. The details were vivid. Descriptions of their secret meetings, stolen kisses, and whispered promises. They painted a picture of a woman he no longer recognized, but it was the last letter that hit him hardest. William doesn't understand me. He's distant, always wrapped up in work. I feel like I'm invisible to him. With you, I feel alive again. I need to make a decision soon, for both our sakes. The words burned in his mind. Invisible? Distant? He had dedicated his life to building a stable future for her, sacrificing his time, his energy, his very self. And this was how she repaid him. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway jolted William back to the present. He shoved the letters back into the drawer, heart pounding. The front door opened and Rachel called out, "William, you home?" He took a deep breath, wiping the sweat from his palms before stepping into the living room. "Yeah, I'm here," he replied, his voice calm despite the storm inside him. Rachel smiled at him, carrying a bag of groceries into the kitchen. "I picked up that coffee you like," she said casually, as if nothing were wrong. "Thanks," William muttered, watching her every move. The ease with which she carried on enraged him further. How could she be so composed when she was leading a double life? Over the next few days, William became quieter, more observant. Rachel seemed oblivious, but William noticed every detail. The way she clutched her purse tighter when leaving the house, the way she hesitated before answering simple questions. One night when Rachel was in the shower, William found her phone left on the nightstand. It wasn't locked. His hands trembled as he scrolled through her messages. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow night, same spot as always. Love, T." The message was sent just an hour earlier. Tomorrow night, same spot. A surge of adrenaline coursed through William's veins. He finally had a plan. The following evening, Rachel left the house once more, claiming she needed to pick up something from a friend. William waited for her car to disappear down the street before grabbing his keys and following at a safe distance. His suspicions were confirmed when Rachel pulled into a secluded area near the base. There, under the dim glow of a streetlight, stood Thomas Reed, young, confident, and completely unaware of the storm heading his way. William parked far enough to remain unseen but close enough to observe. Rachel stepped out of her car, her face lighting up as Thomas approached. They embraced briefly before speaking in hushed tones. Every muscle in William's body tensed as he watched. He gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, his vision narrowing on the two figures laughing together. The following night, William parked his truck in the shadows of an old oak tree near the secluded meeting spot. The glow of his dashboard lights barely illuminated his hands, which rested tensely on the steering wheel. His eyes were locked on the scene ahead. Rachel's car parked under a streetlight, its warm yellow glow bathing her and Thomas Reed as they spoke in hushed voices. William's heart pounded in his chest, his breaths shallow. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to storm out of the truck and confront them, but he stayed rooted in place, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. He needed to see, needed to know exactly what was happening. Rachel leaned against her car, her arms crossed. Thomas stepped closer, his posture confident, his voice carrying just enough for William to catch snippets. "I told you, Rachel, you deserve more than this. You deserve someone who sees you, who makes you a priority." William clenched his jaw, his teeth grinding together. He leaned forward, his focus narrowing. Rachel laughed softly, the sound a knife twisting in his chest. "It's not that simple, Thomas," she said. "I don't want to hurt him. Not like this." Hurt him? William's mind raced. She was still trying to protect him, yet here she was, entangled with another man. His rage warred with confusion, each emotion feeding the other in an endless loop. Thomas closed the gap between them. "He doesn't appreciate you, Rachel. He's too focused on his job, his reputation. When was the last time he made you feel like you mattered?" His voice dropped, his hand brushing against her arm. "You matter to me." William's grip on the steering wheel tightened as his nails bit into the leather. Every word Thomas spoke stoked the fire burning inside him. He felt betrayed not just by Rachel but by Thomas too, a soldier he had once trusted. now conspiring to dismantle his life. Rachel stepped back, her movements hesitant. "I need time, Thomas," she said, her voice shaky. "This isn't just about me. Or you. It's complicated." Thomas reached for her hand, holding it gently. "You know where I stand, Rachel. I'll wait for you. But not forever." William's vision blurred with fury as he watched them part ways. Rachel climbed into her car and drove off, her taillights fading into the distance. Thomas lingered for a moment, his hands resting on his hips, before heading toward his own vehicle. William's hands trembled as he started his truck, keeping his headlights off as he tailed Thomas at a safe distance. Every mile felt like a century, his mind replaying the conversation over and over. He wanted answers, needed them, but he wasn't ready to face Rachel just yet. Thomas pulled into a small, dimly lit bar on the edge of town. William parked a few spots away, remaining in the shadows. He watched as Thomas walked inside, his confident stride infuriatingly unshaken. The minutes dragged on as William wrestled with his emotions. He wanted to confront Thomas, to demand an explanation, but something held him back, a small, rational voice buried deep beneath the storm. What if he was wrong? What if this confrontation made things worse? Finally, Thomas emerged, his jacket slung casually over one shoulder. He didn't notice William's truck as he made his way to his car, humming softly to himself. William's eyes narrowed, his rage simmering just below the surface. Before he could stop himself, William stepped out of his truck. His boots crunched against the gravel as he closed the distance between them. Thomas froze, his head snapping up at the sound. "Sergeant Hance?" he said, his voice a mixture of surprise and caution. William's words came low and measured, each one laced with venom. "We need to talk, Reed." Thomas took a step back, his hand instinctively moving toward his car door. "Look, I don't know what you think." "I don't think," William cut him off, his voice rising. "I know, and you're going to tell me everything." Thomas squared his shoulders, his expression shifting from surprise to defiance. "You don't scare me, Sergeant. If you have a problem, take it up with your wife." William's breath caught, his fists clenching at his sides. The tension hung thick in the air as the two men faced off under the dim light of the parking lot. The dim parking lot fell silent, the tension crackling between William and Thomas like a live wire. Thomas squared his shoulders, his defiant gaze fixed on William. For a moment, neither man moved, their breaths clouding the cold night air. "You think you can just come into my life and take what's mine?" William's voice was low, almost a growl. His fists clenched at his sides, his knuckles white against his skin. Thomas smirked, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "What's yours? Rachel made her own decisions, Sergeant. Maybe you should ask yourself why she chose me." The words hit like a punch to the gut, but William didn't flinch. Instead, he took a step closer, closing the distance between them. "You don't know a damn thing about her. Or me." Thomas didn't back down. "I know enough. I know she's been miserable for years, pretending to be the perfect wife to a man who barely notices her. She deserves better. She deserves to be happy." William's composure cracked. He grabbed Thomas by the collar, his face inches away. "And you think you're the answer to her problems? You're nothing but a distraction. A mistake she'll regret." Thomas pushed him off, his movements sharp, his voice rising. "Maybe, but at least I make her feel like she matters. Can you say the same?" The accusation hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. William stared at Thomas, his chest heaving, his mind spinning. He wanted to deny it, to shout him down, but deep inside a small, painful voice whispered that Thomas might be right. Before either could say another word, the sound of approaching footsteps broke the standoff. William stepped back, his jaw tight, his fists still trembling. Thomas adjusted his jacket, his smirk returning. "Looks like we'll have to finish this another time," he said, turning toward his car. William watched him leave, his mind a storm of anger, confusion, and something dangerously close to despair. He had come here seeking answers, but all he had found were more questions. By the time William returned home, the house was dark. Rachel was in bed, her soft breathing filling the silence. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her sleep, his emotions a tangled mess. How could she betray him like this? How could she lie to his face every day, knowing what she was doing behind his back? The next morning, William confronted her. He sat at the kitchen table, the letters and photographs spread out before him like evidence in a trial. Rachel froze in the doorway, her eyes darting between him and the damning items on the table. Care to explain this? William's voice was calm, but his eyes burned with accusation. Rachel stepped forward slowly, her hands trembling. William, it's not what you think. Not what I think? He laughed bitterly, gesturing to the letters. So you're not sneaking around with Thomas? These letters, they're nothing? Rachel's shoulders sagged, her eyes filling with tears. I made a mistake, she said softly. I was lonely. You were always so busy, so distant. I didn't know how to reach you anymore. That's your excuse? William's voice rose, his anger finally spilling over. You destroy everything we've built because you're lonely? I didn't mean for it to happen, Rachel pleaded. It just happened. And I've been trying to figure out how to fix it, how to fix us. Us? William's laugh was harsh. There is no us anymore, Rachel. You killed that the moment you let him into our lives. Rachel's tears fell freely now, her voice shaking. Please, William, we can get through this. I'll end it. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. But William shook his head, his heart a cold, heavy weight in his chest. It's too late, he said quietly. You've already made your choice. Rachel collapsed into a chair, her sobs filling the room. William stood there, his fists clenched, his jaw tight. He wanted to feel victorious, to feel like he had taken back control, but all he felt was empty. As the day wore on, the silence between them grew unbearable. Rachel retreated to the bedroom and William sat alone in the living room, the letters still spread across the table. He picked one up, reading it again, the words cutting into him like a knife. He didn't know what he would do next. All he knew was that things couldn't stay the same. Something had to change, one way or another. The air was heavy that night, thick with the weight of unspoken intentions. William parked his truck in the shadows, far enough from the meeting spot to remain unseen but close enough to witness everything. His fingers tapped the steering wheel rhythmically, a nervous energy coursing through him as he waited. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, cutting through the darkness. It was Thomas Reed's car. William's chest tightened as he watched the younger soldier step out, his posture exuding the same arrogance that had fueled their earlier confrontation. Thomas looked around, adjusting his jacket as if preparing for a casual conversation. But this wasn't casual, at least not for William. Tonight, things would be resolved. William emerged from his truck, the gravel crunching under his boots as he approached. His steps were slow, deliberate, each one measured to conceal the storm brewing within him. Thomas turned at the sound, his eyes narrowing in recognition. Sergeant Hance! Thomas's voice carried a hint of surprise mixed with wariness. What are you doing here? William didn't answer immediately. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze fixed on Thomas. We need to talk, he said, his tone sharp, each word laced with restrained anger. Thomas tilted his head slightly, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Talk? About what, Rachel? The casual mention of her name was like fuel to the fire. William's jaw tightened as he stepped closer. You've crossed a line, Reed. You've been messing with my life, my wife. It ends tonight. Thomas didn't back down. Instead, he folded his arms across his chest, his smirk growing. Your life? Your wife? Last I checked, Rachel came to me. She made her choice, Sergeant. Maybe it's time you accept that. William's fists clenched at his sides, the tremor in his hands betraying the fury boiling beneath his surface. You don't know what you're talking about. Rachel and I, our life together, it's not something you can just walk into and tear apart. Thomas's expression hardened, his voice cutting like a blade. Then maybe you should have taken better care of her. She's tired of being ignored, of being second place to your precious army career. The words hit William like a punch to the gut, but instead of backing down, he stepped even closer, his face inches from Thomas's. You think you can judge me? You don't know the first thing about what it means to be a man, to build a family, to protect it. Thomas shoved him back, the smirk gone from his face. You're right, I don't know. But I do know what it feels like to be chosen. Rachel chose me, Hance. She sees something in me she doesn't see in you anymore. The silence that followed was deafening, the tension between them thick enough to cut. William's breathing was ragged, his vision narrowing as his emotions overtook him. "I warned you," William growled, his voice barely above a whisper. "I told you to stay away." "And I told you," Thomas shot back, his voice rising, "that I'm not going anywhere." The next few moments passed in a blur. William lunged forward, his fists colliding with Thomas's chest. The younger man stumbled back but quickly regained his footing, throwing a punch that grazed William's jaw. The fight escalated rapidly, the sound of grunts and shouts echoing in the otherwise silent night. Thomas managed to land a solid blow, sending William staggering. "You're pathetic," Thomas spat, his chest heaving. "No wonder she wants out." The words sent William over the edge. He reached for the nearest object, a heavy wrench left on the ground near a toolbox in Thomas's car. Without thinking, without hesitation, he swung. The impact was sickening, a dull thud that reverberated through the night. Thomas crumpled to the ground, motionless. William stood over him, the wrench still clutched in his trembling hand, his breaths ragged and shallow. As the adrenaline began to fade, the weight of what he had done settled over him. He looked around frantically, his mind racing. He couldn't leave it like this. He had to make it look like something else. Quickly he began to stage the scene, his hands moving almost on autopilot. A wallet tossed on the ground, the car door left ajar. Small details that might divert attention, confused the investigators. When he finally stepped back, his heart pounding in his chest, he realized the depth of his actions. There was no turning back now. Rachel stood at the kitchen sink, staring out the window at the empty driveway. The morning sun streamed through the glass, illuminating her furrowed brow. William had left early, saying little as he grabbed his keys and walked out the door. Lately, his silences were heavier, his presence colder. She glanced at her watch. There were errands to run, tasks to keep her busy, but a nagging feeling tugged at her thoughts. Something wasn't right. Moving to the living room, Rachel noticed William's duffel bag resting near the couch. He never left it there. It was always neatly tucked away in the bedroom closet. Curiosity turned to suspicion as she knelt beside it, her fingers hesitating before pulling the zipper open. Inside, the first thing she saw was his wrench, its handle stained with something dark, something dried. Her breath caught in her throat as she pulled it out, her trembling hands turning it over. Was it? No, it couldn't be, but the weight in her chest said otherwise. Digging further, she found a crumpled shirt, the fabric stiff with dried blood. Rachel's stomach churned as memories flooded back. William's tense demeanor, his late nights, his refusal to talk. She pressed her hand to her mouth, her mind racing. Her first instinct was to call him, demand answers, but fear held her back. Instead, she searched deeper, uncovering a torn photograph. It was of Thomas, standing beside his car, smiling, a photo she hadn't seen before. The realization hit her like a freight train. Thomas, William had done something terrible. The sound of the front door opening startled her. She shoved the items back into the bag, her heart pounding as she stood to face William. He entered, his face shadowed with exhaustion, his eyes narrowing as they landed on her. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice low, almost a growl. Rachel forced a smile, her mind scrambling for an excuse. "I was just tidying up. Your bag was out and I thought, don't touch my things." His tone was sharp, final. He stepped closer, his gaze drilling into her. "Understand?" She nodded quickly, her palms slick with sweat. William's presence filled the room, suffocating, oppressive. He grabbed the bag, slinging it over his shoulder without another word. As he disappeared down the hall, Rachel exhaled shakily. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone, but again she hesitated. What would she say? Who could she even call? That night, as William slept, Rachel lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her mind replayed the details over and over. The wrench, the shirt, the photograph. Each piece of evidence painted a grim picture, one she couldn't ignore. The following day, Rachel made her decision. She would confront him. She couldn't keep living like this, surrounded by secrets and fear. When William returned from the base that evening, Rachel waited for him in the living room. She stood as he entered, her heart pounding in her chest. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. William paused, his eyes narrowing. About what? Rachel clenched her fists, her nails biting into her palms. About Thomas, about what you did to him. His expression didn't change, but his shoulders stiffened. What are you talking about? Don't lie to me, William. Her voice cracked, her emotions threatening to spill over. I saw your bag. I saw the wrench, the shirt, the photo. I know something happened. William's jaw tightened, his eyes locking onto hers. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't do that, Rachel shouted, her frustration boiling over. Don't treat me like I'm stupid. I know what I saw. I know what you've been hiding. Silence filled the room, heavy and suffocating. William stepped closer, his voice cold and measured. You need to stop asking questions you don't want the answers to. Rachel's breath hitched. For the first time, she saw a side of William she didn't recognize. Cold, calculating, dangerous. She took a step back, her mind screaming at her to run, to leave, to do something. But before she could act, William spoke again, his voice chilling. If you want to keep this family together, you'll drop it. Now! Rachel stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. She nodded slowly, her instincts taking over as she backed away. But deep down, she knew the truth. She couldn't stay silent. She wouldn't. The quiet hum of the town was shattered when Thomas Reed's body was discovered early the next morning. A passerby had noticed his car idling in the lot, its door ajar and the engine cold. The sight of his lifeless form, slumped awkwardly on the gravel, sent shockwaves through Fort Benning and beyond. The military police cordoned off the area, their crisp uniforms and sharp movements contrasting starkly with the grim scene before them. Yellow tape flapped in the breeze, marking the edges of the crime scene as investigators combed through every inch of evidence. Nearby, curious onlookers whispered among themselves, their voices hushed but urgent. Who could have done this? I heard it was a robbery gone wrong. Do you think it's someone from the base? Inside the perimeter, investigator James Ellis crouched near the body, his gloved hands examining the wrench left discarded a few feet away. Blood stained its surface, a damning piece of evidence that hinted at a violent struggle. His partner, Officer Carla Vega, snapped photographs, her lens capturing every detail. This wasn't random, Ellis muttered, his tone flat. The precision of the blow. Whoever did this wasn't panicked, they were angry. Vega nodded, her expression grim. We'll know more once we run forensics, but something tells me this goes deeper than a robbery. Back at the station, William Hance sat at his desk, the weight of the previous night pressing down on him. His hands trembled slightly as he shuffled papers, his mind elsewhere. He had done his best to act normal, to blend in, but every glance from his colleagues felt like scrutiny, every casual question like an interrogation. The door to his office creaked open and Sergeant Major Daniels stepped in, his face stern. Hance, we need to talk. William's stomach tightened. What about, sir? He asked, keeping his voice steady. Daniels folded his arms. It's about Thomas Reed. You heard what happened? William nodded slowly. I heard he was found. Terrible news. Daniels studied him, his gaze piercing. The investigators are saying it looks like a personal attack, not a random act of violence. You and Reed ever have issues? The question hit like a thunderclap. William forced himself to meet Daniels' gaze. No, sir, I barely knew the man. We crossed paths occasionally, but nothing significant. Daniels nodded, but his eyes didn't waver. Good, just making sure. They'll probably want to talk to everyone who knew him. Be prepared. As Daniels left, William exhaled, his chest tight. He knew it was only a matter of time before the investigators came knocking. His alibi was thin, his nerves even thinner. Sure enough, that evening, Ellis and Vega arrived at William's doorstep. Their presence was unassuming yet authoritative, their questions pointed but polite. Sergeant Hance, Ellis began, his notebook poised. We're following up on Reed's death. Can you tell us where you were last night? William's pulse quickened, but he kept his expression neutral. Home, he said firmly. I didn't feel well, so I turned in early. Ellis tilted his head slightly, his pen hovering over the page. And can anyone confirm that? My wife, William replied. Rachel, she was home with me all evening. The answer felt hollow, even to his own ears. Ellis scribbled something down, his face unreadable. We'll need to speak with her too. William nodded, his palms sweating. Of course. As the investigators left, Rachel appeared at the top of the stairs, her face pale. They're going to ask me, aren't they? She said, her voice trembling. William met her gaze, his own filled with a mixture of pleading and warning. You need to tell them I was here, he said quietly, that we were together all night. Rachel's breath hitched. But William, please, he interrupted, his voice firmer now. If you don't, it's over. For both of us. Rachel nodded slowly, tears brimming in her eyes. She didn't trust him, didn't trust anything anymore, but what choice did she have? As the night deepened, William sat alone in the living room, the weight of his actions pressing down harder than ever. The investigators were closing in and he knew it. His only hope now was to stay one step ahead. The knock at the door came earlier than expected. Rachel, still dressed in her robe, opened it cautiously to find Investigator Ellis and Officer Vega standing on the porch, their expressions unreadable but resolute. Mrs. Hance, Ellis began, his tone professional but firm, we need to ask you a few questions about the night of Thomas Reed's death. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest. She nodded, stepping aside to let them in. William appeared in the hallway, his face carefully composed, but his hands tucked into his pockets to hide their slight tremor. Ellis wasted no time. Mrs. Hance, your husband told us he was home with you all evening. Can you confirm that? Rachel hesitated, her eyes darting to William. His gaze bore into hers, a silent plea masked by his stoic demeanor. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. Yes, she said finally. He was here, all night. Vega scribbled something in her notebook, her pen moving quickly. And you didn't notice anything unusual? No signs that he might have left the house? Rachel shook her head, her voice steadier now. No, he wasn't feeling well, so we stayed in, watched some TV and went to bed early. Ellis raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. Instead, he slid a photograph across the table, a close-up of the wrench found at the scene. Do you recognize this? Rachel's breath hitched. She stared at the image, her mind flashing back to the blood-stained tool she had found in William's bag. Her fingers gripped the edge of the table as she forced herself to shake her head. No, I don't. Ellis leaned back, studying her carefully. Are you sure? It's a pretty distinctive tool. Yes, Rachel replied firmly, her voice betraying none of the turmoil inside her. I've never seen it before. Ellis exchanged a glance with Vega, his expression thoughtful. All right, he said finally, rising to his feet. Thank you for your time. We may need to follow up with more questions later. As the investigators left, Rachel closed the door behind them and leaned against it, her legs trembling. William approached her, his face dark. Thank you, he said quietly. Rachel turned to him, her eyes blazing. Don't thank me, William. I don't know how much longer I can do this. You don't have a choice, he replied, his tone cold. If you turn on me, we both go down. Meanwhile, at the station, Ellis and Vega reviewed the evidence once more. The fingerprints on the wrench were inconclusive, but a witness had come forward, a man who claimed to have seen William's truck near the crime scene that night. This is starting to add up, Vega said, pointing to the board where photographs and notes were pinned. The timeline, the motive, it's all there. We just need something solid to tie him to the scene. Ellis nodded. And we'll get it. People like Hance, they think they can outsmart us, but they always slip up. That slip came sooner than expected. The next day, Rachel received an anonymous letter in the mail. Inside was a single photograph. Thomas Reed and Rachel laughing together at a picnic. The note scrawled across the back read, Your secrets won't stay buried forever. Rachel's hands shook as she stared at the picture, her mind racing. She knew this wasn't from the investigators. It was from someone else, someone who knew more than they should. That evening, she confronted William again, this time unable to hold back her fear. They know, she said, thrusting the photograph at him. Whoever sent this, they know everything. William stared at the image, his jaw tightening. It's a scare tactic, he said dismissively. They're trying to rattle us. It's working, Rachel snapped. I can't live like this anymore, William. I can't keep lying. You don't have a choice, William repeated, his voice like ice. We're in this together, whether you like it or not. As Rachel stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her, William sat in silence, the photograph still clutched in his hand. He knew the walls were closing in, and his grip on the situation was slipping. The courtroom buzzed with muted conversations as people filled the wooden benches. The air was thick with anticipation and tension, every eye in the room fixed on the defendant's table. William Hance sat rigid, his military posture unbroken, though his face betrayed a man fighting to maintain control. Beside him, his defense attorney whispered last-minute instructions, but William's gaze remained forward, his jaw tight. Rachel sat a few rows behind him, her face pale, her hands gripping the edge of the bench. She hadn't spoken to William since the night of the photograph. Now she felt like an outsider, watching the pieces of her life crumble in a room full of strangers. "All rise," the bailiff announced, and the judge entered, his expression stern as he took his seat. The trial was about to begin. The prosecution wasted no time, laying out their case with meticulous precision. Photographs of the crime scene, forensic reports, and the wrench stained with blood were displayed for the jury. Each piece of evidence painted a damning picture. "Ladies and gentlemen," the prosecutor began, pacing before the jury, "this case is about betrayal, jealousy, and the deadly consequences of rage. The evidence will show that Sergeant William Hance not only murdered Thomas Reed, but did so with premeditation and malice." The words hung in the air, sharp and unforgiving. Rachel flinched at their weight, her eyes darting to William, who remained expressionless. The first witness was called, a forensic analyst who confirmed that the blood on the wrench matched Thomas Reed's. Next, a neighbor testified to hearing a loud argument between William and Thomas the night of the murder. Each testimony tightened the noose around William, but the most damaging moment came when the prosecution revealed a letter found among Rachel's belongings. "This letter," the prosecutor said, holding it up, "written by the victim, Thomas Reed, describes his relationship with Rachel Hance. It also details his intention to confront William about his treatment of Rachel. This confrontation, we argue, led directly to the fatal attack." Rachel's breath caught in her throat as the letter was read aloud. The courtroom fell silent, every word slicing through the air like a blade. She could feel the stares, the judgment, and the pity from those around her. When it was the defense's turn, William's attorney tried to shift the narrative. "What we see here," he argued, "is not premeditated murder, but a tragic escalation of a heated argument. Sergeant Hance is a man who served his country honorably, who was pushed to the brink by betrayal and emotional distress." The defense called Rachel to the stand. As she walked to the front, the room seemed to close in around her. The attorney's questions were careful, measured. "Mrs. Hance," he began, "did your husband ever exhibit violent tendencies before this incident?" "No," Rachel replied softly, her voice barely audible. "He was always controlled, until recently." "And did you feel threatened by him prior to that night?" Rachel hesitated, her gaze flickering to William. "No," she said finally, "but things changed. He became different." The prosecution pounced on her words during cross-examination. "Mrs. Hance, do you believe your husband was capable of murder?" Rachel froze, her mouth dry. The room waited with bated breath. I don't know anymore," she whispered. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, the tension palpable. William's expression darkened, his fists clenching under the table. Finally, after days of testimony and evidence, the closing arguments began. The prosecution urged the jury to deliver justice for Thomas Reed, painting William as a man consumed by jealousy and rage. The defense pleaded for leniency, emphasizing William's service record and the emotional turmoil he had endured. The jury deliberated for hours, each second stretching into an eternity. When they finally returned, the room fell silent, all eyes on the foreman. "We, the jury, find the defendant, William Hance, guilty of first-degree murder." Rachel gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. William closed his eyes, his composure breaking for the first time as the weight of the verdict settled over him. The judge's voice echoed through the room. "Sergeant Hance, you are hereby sentenced to death by lethal injection." As the gavel struck, sealing his fate, William turned to glance at Rachel. Their eyes met briefly, hers filled with tears, his with something unspoken. Regret? Defiance? She couldn't tell. The room was still as the gavel struck for the final time. The sound echoed, sharp and unforgiving, marking the conclusion of the trial that had consumed so many lives. William Hance sat motionless at the defense table, his gaze fixed on an indeterminate point ahead. For a moment it seemed he hadn't even heard the verdict, but the tight clench of his jaw betrayed him. "Sergeant Hance," the judge's voice broke through the tension, measured and heavy. "You have been found guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence is death by lethal injection, to be carried out at a date determined by the state." Rachel sat in the gallery, her body trembling. She gripped the edge of the bench as if it were the only thing anchoring her to reality. The air around her felt suffocating, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. She wanted to cry out, to say something, anything, but no words came. William turned slightly, his eyes meeting hers for the briefest moment. His expression was unreadable, a storm of emotions masked by the stoicism he'd perfected during his years in the military. Regret flickered there, but it was swallowed by something darker, resignation, perhaps, or the weight of consequences finally accepted. The judge continued, addressing the court. "This case has brought to light the devastating consequences of betrayal, anger, and violence. It is a sobering reminder of the fragility of human relationships and the destruction they can wreak when trust is broken." The courtroom emptied slowly, the murmur of hushed voices and shuffling footsteps filling the void. Rachel remained seated, unable to move. Around her, reporters whispered furiously into their phones, lawyers packed their briefcases, and spectators filed out, their faces a mixture of curiosity and satisfaction. "Mrs. Hance?" A voice pulled her from her thoughts. It was Investigator Ellis, his expression kinder now than it had been during the trial. "Do you need someone to walk you out?" She shook her head, rising unsteadily to her feet. "No, thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Ellis nodded but didn't press further. He stepped aside as Rachel walked down the aisle, her movements mechanical. Outside, the late afternoon sun was blinding. She blinked against its brightness, her mind racing. Memories of William flooded her thoughts. Their wedding day, his laugh, the quiet nights when the weight of the world seemed lighter simply because he was there. How had it come to this? How had they fallen so far, so fast? The prison transport vehicle waited at the side entrance of the courthouse. William was led out in shackles, flanked by guards. Rachel stood at a distance, hidden among the crowd, as he was loaded into the van. Before the doors closed, he looked back once more. Their eyes met again, and this time she saw it clearly. Regret, not just for what he had done, but for what could never be undone. As the van pulled away, Rachel felt a strange sense of finality. There was no going back now. William's actions had set them both on this path, and all that remained were the consequences they would have to live or die with. Back at the base, the whispers had already begun. Soldiers and their families speculated endlessly about the trial, the affair, the murders. Thomas Reed had become a tragic figure, Rachel a symbol of infidelity, and William was the villain of a story that once seemed so ordinary. Weeks passed. The day of William's execution loomed closer, and Rachel received a letter in the mail. It was from him, written in his unmistakable, sharp handwriting. "I don't expect forgiveness," the letter began, "but I hope someday you'll understand why I did what I did. I lost myself in the anger, the betrayal. I wanted to hurt him like I hurt, but in the end I only destroyed myself." Rachel read the letter in silence, her tears falling onto the page. She folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer with the other remnants of their life together. The pain was still fresh, but the letter offered a strange kind of closure, a reminder that, despite everything, he had once been the man she loved. On the day of William's execution, the prison grounds were silent, the weight of finality hanging in the air. Rachel didn't attend. She stayed home, staring at the photograph of their wedding day, her fingers tracing the edges of his face. As the clock struck midnight, she whispered to the empty room, "Goodbye, William." What do you think of William Henry Hance and the chilling events surrounding this case? From which region are you watching this video? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more captivating true crime stories. Thank you for watching.